On the coldest Christmas night Montana had seen in 20 years, a millionaire CEO made a choice that would destroy everything he'd built. He stopped for a stranger freezing at a bus stop, a nurse in thin scrubs who whispered 5 words that changed 3 lives forever: "I can't go home." But when he brought her into his house, his teenage son heard her voice and shattered a glass in terror, recognizing the woman his father had just saved. A woman who'd vanished from his life 5 years ago without explanation. A woman whose disappearance had silenced him for months and left scars no one could see. What connected them? Why did she vanish? And what secret was so dangerous that it cost her everything: her career, her family, her future, while the person responsible spent 5 years pretending to be a hero? This is a story about the lies we believe, the people we trust, and the moment when staying silent becomes more unbearable than losing everything. Because some truths are worth more than empires. And some debts can only be repaid by choosing what's right over what's easy. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and comment below telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories like this to life. The snow fell like broken glass that Christmas night, sharp and relentless, covering Highway 87 outside Riverton, Montana in a white shroud that made everything disappear. Graham Whitlock's Mercedes cut through the blizzard at 40 miles per hour, headlights barely piercing the wall of white ahead. The radio crackled with warnings about the storm intensifying, roads closing, temperatures dropping to 15 below zero. He should have stayed at the office Christmas party. He should have waited until morning. But some inexplicable urgency, had pulled him away from the champagne and forced smiles, sent him driving through the worst storm Montana had seen in 20 years. He almost didn't see her. A shape at the bus stop. A silhouette hunched against the plexiglass shelter that offered no real protection from the savage wind. Graham's foot moved to the brake instinctively, the car sliding slightly on black ice before steadying. For a moment, he thought it was a pile of discarded clothes, or maybe a trick of the snow and shadows. Then the shape moved, a tremor, a shiver, and Graham realized with a jolt of horror that it was a person. A woman. He pulled over, hazard lights blinking orange against the white, and stepped out into the cold that immediately stole his breath. The wind screamed, pulling at his wool coat like angry hands. He ran toward the bus shelter, snow crunching under his Italian leather shoes, already soaked through. She was small, curled into herself like a wounded animal, wearing what looked like scrubs, thin, pale blue scrubs with cartoon teddy bears on them, and a jacket that wouldn't have kept anyone warm even in September. Her hands were pressed between her knees, and even from 3 feet away, Graham could see they were purple, the color of old bruises, the color of frostbite setting in. "Ma'am." His voice was rough, urgent. "Ma'am, you can't stay here." She didn't respond. Her head was down, dark hair plastered to her face by melting snow, shoulders shaking with cold so violent it looked like convulsions. Graham's heart hammered. How long had she been here? The last bus would have passed hours ago, if any buses were even running in this weather. "Please," he said, kneeling down so he could see her face, his expensive pants immediately soaking through. "You need to get out of this cold. Let me help you." Slowly, so slowly it hurt to watch, she lifted her head. Her face was pale, lips blue, eyes unfocused. But when those eyes met his, brown, deep brown, filled with something that looked like resignation, something shifted in Graham's chest. She opened her mouth, tried to speak, but her jaw was trembling so hard the words wouldn't come. "My car is right there," Graham said, pointing. "It's warm. Please." She stared at him for what felt like an eternity, and in that stare, Graham saw something that made his throat tighten. She was deciding whether to live or die. Whether getting up was worth it. Whether anything was worth it anymore. "Please," he whispered. Finally, she nodded. Just barely. Graham helped her stand, and she was so light, so fragile, that fear spiked through him. How long since she'd eaten? He half carried her to the car, her feet barely working, and settled her into the passenger seat. The heat was blasting, the leather seats warm, and the contrast made her gasp, a small, broken sound that cut through Graham like a knife. He ran around to the driver's side, got in, cranked the heat higher. She sat there, hands still pressed between her knees, shaking so hard her teeth rattled. On her chest, a name tag was visible beneath the thin jacket, Lena Cross, RN. A nurse. Out here. Alone. On Christmas night. Where do you live? Graham asked gently. I'll take you home. The shaking intensified. She turned her head away, looking out the window at the storm, and when she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet he almost missed it beneath the heater's roar. I can't go home. The words hung in the air like smoke. Graham's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He thought of his own home, 5 miles up the road, the massive log mansion, the guest rooms, the fireplace, the silence. The empty silence. Then you'll come with me, he said. Not a question. A decision. She didn't argue. Didn't thank him. Just kept staring out the window as Graham pulled back onto the highway, driving carefully through the storm toward the iron gates of his property. The house rose out of the snow like something from a different era, log and stone, windows glowing warm against the darkness. Graham had built it 10 years ago, after his wife died, thinking that size could somehow fill the void she left. It hadn't. It had just made the void echo louder. He helped Lena inside, her movements still jerky and uncoordinated from the cold. In the foyer, under the chandelier made from antlers, she looked even smaller, even more lost. He guided her to the living room, to the leather couch in front of the stone fireplace where logs crackled and popped. Sit, he said, grabbing the cashmere throw from the chair. I'll get you something hot to drink. She sank onto the couch, pulling the blanket around herself with hands that still wouldn't stop shaking. Graham went to the kitchen, his mind racing. He should call someone. The hospital maybe. The police. But something in the way she'd said, I can't go home, stopped him. There was a story there. A dark one. He made hot chocolate, the expensive kind, with real cream, and brought it back to find her staring at the flames, tears running down her face that she didn't bother to wipe away. Here, he said softly, pressing the mug into her hands. She took it, wrapped her purple fingers around the ceramic, and Graham watched the steam rise up to bathe her face in warmth. Thank you, she whispered, and those 2 words carried the weight of mountains. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds the fire and the storm outside. Graham was about to speak when he heard it, footsteps on the stairs. Quick footsteps, then a pause. He turned to see his son, Evan, standing at the bottom of the staircase in sweatpants and an old University of Montana hoodie, earbuds dangling from his neck. Dad, I thought you were. Evan stopped mid-sentence. His eyes had found Lena, who was facing away from him, still hunched over her hot chocolate. Graham was about to make introductions when something happened that he would replay in his mind for months to come. Lena coughed, just a small, tired cough, and in that sound, in that one simple human sound, Evan's face changed completely. The color drained from it. His mouth opened slightly, his eyes went wide, and the glass of water he'd been holding slipped from his fingers and shattered on the hardwood floor with a crash that made Graham jump. Evan. Graham stood up, but his son wasn't moving, wasn't blinking, was just staring at Lena's back with an expression Graham had never seen before, terror mixed with something else, something deeper. Recognition. Lena had gone completely still at the sound of the breaking glass. Her shoulders tensed, her breathing changed. Slowly, like someone in a nightmare who knows what's waiting when they turn around, she looked over her shoulder. Their eyes met. The air in the room became thick, heavy, charged with something Graham couldn't name. Evan took a step backward, then another, his hand coming up as if to ward something off. No, he whispered, the word barely audible. No, no, no. Evan, what? Graham started, but his son was already moving, backing toward the stairs, his eyes never leaving Lena's face. "She can't be here," Evan said, his voice rising, cracking. "Dad, she can't be here." "Evan, calm down. You don't understand." Evan's voice was nearly a shout now, his chest heaving. That's her. Dad, that's." But he couldn't finish. Whatever words he was trying to say got stuck in his throat, and suddenly his face crumpled, tears spilling over, and he turned and ran up the stairs, his footsteps pounding on the wood before a door slammed so hard the whole house seemed to shake. Graham stood frozen, his mind trying to process what had just happened. He looked at Lena, who had turned back to face the fire, but not before he saw the expression on her face: guilt, fear, and something that looked almost like grief. "What?" Graham's voice came out hoarse. He cleared his throat, tried again. "What was that? Do you know my son?" Lena's hands trembled around the mug, hot chocolate sloshing dangerously close to the rim. When she spoke, her voice was hollow, empty. "I was his nurse," she said. 5 years ago. When he was in the hospital. After the accident." "The accident?" Graham felt his stomach drop. The car crash that had nearly killed Evan when he was 13. 6 weeks in the hospital, surgeries, pain that no child should have to endure. And afterward, months of silence, of Evan retreating into himself, refusing to speak to anyone, not even the therapists. Graham had thought it was trauma, PTSD, that time would heal it. But Evan had spoken. Eventually. One day he just started talking again, as if nothing had happened, though he was never quite the same. Quieter. More distant. As if some essential part of him had been left in that hospital room. He never mentioned, Graham started, but stopped because Lena was shaking her head. "He wouldn't," she said quietly. "Because I left. I disappeared. One day I was there, and the next." She trailed off, staring into the fire. "The next day, I was fired. Escorted out by security. I never got to say goodbye to any of my patients. Including your son." The words settled over Graham like snow, cold and suffocating. Upstairs, he could hear muffled sounds, crying, maybe, or something breaking. His son, who hadn't cried in years, who had locked himself behind walls no one could scale, was falling apart in his room. "Why?" Graham asked, and the single word contained 1,000 questions. Lena looked at him then, really looked at him, and in her eyes Graham saw years of pain, of injustice, of carrying a weight that should never have been hers alone. "Because someone needed a scapegoat," she said softly. "And I was convenient." Outside, the storm howled louder, as if the world itself was screaming. Inside, in the warm glow of the fireplace, Graham Whitlock felt his carefully ordered life begin to crack, felt all the questions he'd never asked, all the truths he'd never wanted to see, rising up from the depths like bodies from a frozen lake. He looked at the woman on his couch, the nurse he'd found freezing to death at a bus stop, the ghost from his son's past, and realized with sudden, terrifying clarity that this Christmas night was not an accident. It was a reckoning. And nothing would ever be the same. The sound of Evan's door slamming echoed through the house like a gunshot, reverberating off the vaulted ceilings and expensive art on the walls. Graham stood in the living room, paralyzed between two impossible choices: go to his son or stay with the woman who had somehow shattered his composure with nothing more than a cough. He chose his son. He always chose his son. "I'm sorry," he said to Lena, already moving toward the stairs. "I need to go," she said quietly, not looking at him. "Please. Go to him." Graham took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart hammering against his ribs. Evan's room was at the end of the hallway, the door closed, and from behind it came sounds that made Graham's chest constrict, ragged breathing, muffled sobs, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep and dark and long buried. He knocked gently, then tried the handle. Locked. "Evan. Son, please let me in." Silence. Then footsteps, pacing back and forth across the room. Graham pressed his forehead against the door, closing his eyes. "Evan, talk to me. What's going on? How do you know that woman?" More silence, stretching so long Graham thought his son wouldn't answer at all. Then, finally, a voice, thin, broken, younger than 18 had any right to sound. "She can't be here, Dad. She can't. Please make her leave." Graham's throat tightened. In all the years since the accident, through all the therapy sessions and silent dinners and careful conversations, he had never heard this level of panic in Evan's voice. Not even in those first terrible days when the doctors weren't sure if he'd walk again. "Why?" Graham asked softly. "Evan, help me understand. What happened?" The pacing stopped. Graham could picture his son standing in the middle of his room, surrounded by the posters of bands Graham didn't recognize, the hiking equipment he never used anymore, the remnants of a childhood that had ended too soon on an icy road 5 winters ago. "She was the only one," Evan said, and his voice cracked on the words. "When I was in the hospital. The only one who," he broke off, and Graham heard him struggle to breathe, to speak. "Everyone else treated me like I was broken. Like I was this thing to be fixed, you know. The doctors with their clipboards, the therapists with their questions, even you, Dad. You looked at me like I was made of glass." The words hit Graham like physical blows. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he couldn't because somewhere deep down, he knew it was true. He had been so terrified of losing Evan, so desperate to protect what was left, that he'd wrapped his son in bubble wrap and suffocated him. "But her," Evan continued, his voice softening despite the tears Graham could hear in it. "Lena. She was different. She talked to me like I was still human. She told me stories. She stayed with me during the panic attacks when I couldn't breathe, when I thought I was dying. She held my hand and she didn't tell me it would be okay or that I was strong or any of that garbage. She just stayed." Graham slid down the door until he was sitting on the hallway floor, his expensive suit getting wrinkled, not caring. Through the crack under the door, he could see the shadow of Evan's feet, close, so close. "The night terrors," Graham said, remembering. "You had them for weeks. Every night, screaming. And then suddenly they stopped." "She fixed them," Evan whispered. "She figured out I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid of disappearing. Of being forgotten. Of not mattering. So she made me matter. She brought me a notebook and told me to write down one thing every day that proved I existed. Stupid stuff, you know. I made the nurse laugh. I remembered the lyrics to that song. I wanted pancakes and they tasted good. Just proof that I was still real." Graham's eyes burned. He hadn't known. Through all those weeks at the hospital, sleeping in uncomfortable chairs, fighting with insurance companies, managing his business from a laptop in the ICU waiting room, he hadn't known that a nurse, this nurse, was the one actually reaching his son when everyone else, including him, had failed. "What happened?" Graham asked. "Why did she leave?" The silence that followed was different. Heavier. Dangerous. "I don't know," Evan said finally. "One day she was there, during her night shift, and we were talking about colleges even though everyone said I might not walk again, and she was so sure I would. She was so sure. And then the next day, I asked for her and they said she didn't work there anymore. Just like that. Gone. No explanation. No goodbye." Graham heard movement, then the sound of something hitting the wall, soft, like Evan had punched it but without force, more out of despair than anger. "I waited for her to come back," Evan continued, his voice distant now, lost in memory. "Every day, every shift change, I watched the door. I thought maybe she was sick, or on vacation, or had moved to a different floor. I asked everyone. Nobody would tell me anything. It was like she'd never existed. Like I'd imagined the only person who made me want to live. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a picture Graham didn't want to see. The silence that followed Lena's disappearance. Evan's retreat into himself. The way he'd stopped engaging with the therapists, stopped trying to get better for weeks until finally, suddenly, he'd started talking again, but different, hollowed out, going through the motions. "Is that when you stopped talking?" Graham asked quietly. A bitter laugh from behind the door. "I stopped talking because I realized something, Dad. I realized that people disappear. That you can matter to someone and then just be erased. And if that could happen to her, to someone who saved kids for a living, then what chance did I have? What was the point of any of it?" Graham's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the hardwood floor, trying to ground himself. Downstairs, the house was silent. He wondered if Lena could hear this conversation, if she was sitting on that couch understanding for the first time the damage her absence had caused. "But you did start talking again," Graham said. "Eventually." "Yeah," Evan said softly. "Because I got angry. I decided that if the world was going to make people disappear, then I'd be loud enough that nobody could forget me. Except..." He trailed off. "Except what?" "Except I forgot myself instead. I became this person who goes through the motions, who gets good grades and doesn't cause trouble and makes everyone comfortable. But inside, Dad, inside I'm still that kid waiting at the door, hoping she'll come back and tell me I matter." Graham couldn't breathe. The hallway felt too small, too close, the walls pressing in. He thought about all the years he'd spent trying to understand his son, all the parent-teacher conferences where they told him Evan was withdrawn but functional, all the times he'd asked if everything was okay and received one-word answers. He'd thought he was doing enough. He'd thought love and presence and stability were enough. He'd been wrong. "She's here now," Graham said carefully. "She's downstairs. And Evan, I think something bad happened to her. Something that wasn't her choice." The shadow under the door shifted. Evan's voice, when it came, was small and scared. "What if she left because of me? What if I was too much, too broken, too..." "No," Graham said firmly. "Son, no. Whatever happened, it wasn't because of you. She said she was fired. Escorted out by security. She never got to say goodbye to any of her patients." A long pause. "Then, why?" "I don't know yet," Graham admitted. "But I'm going to find out." The lock clicked. Slowly, the door opened, and there was Evan, tall now, nearly Graham's height, but in that moment looking exactly like he had at 13, vulnerable and afraid and desperate for answers that made sense. His eyes were red, his face blotchy from crying, and in his hand he clutched an old spiral notebook, its cover worn and pages yellowed. "Is that..." Graham started. "The notebook she gave me," Evan said. "I kept it. Every single page filled. 5 years of proving I exist." He looked down at it, then back at his father. "I need to talk to her, Dad. I need to know why. I need to know if..." His voice broke. "I need to know if I mattered enough to remember." Graham stood, his knees protesting, and pulled his son into a hug. Evan resisted for only a second before collapsing into it, this boy-man who'd been carrying weight no one should carry alone. "You matter," Graham whispered fiercely. "You have always mattered. To me. To her. To everyone who knows you." But even as he said it, holding his son in a hallway decorated with photographs of happier times, Graham wondered if words were enough anymore. If they'd ever been enough. Downstairs, a woman sat by his fireplace, a woman who'd saved his son and then vanished, a woman who'd been found freezing to death on Christmas night with nowhere to go, a woman whose presence had cracked open wounds everyone thought had healed. And somewhere in all of this was a truth that Graham suddenly, desperately needed to uncover. Not just for Evan's sake. Not just for Lena's. But for his own. Because if someone could be erased so completely, so efficiently, what did that say about the world he'd built? About the people he trusted? About everything he thought he knew? They found Lena exactly where Graham had left her, sitting on the leather couch with the cashmere blanket wrapped around her shoulders like armor. The hot chocolate had gone cold in her hands, untouched, a skin forming on its surface. She didn't look up when they entered the living room, but her entire body tensed, every muscle coiled tight as if preparing for impact. Evan stopped at the bottom of the stairs, one hand gripping the banister so hard his knuckles went white. Graham watched his son's face, saw the war happening there, fear battling hope, anger wrestling with longing. For a moment, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the wind howling outside, rattling the windows in their frames. Lena, Evan said finally, and the name came out rough, unpracticed, like he'd been afraid to say it aloud for 5 years. She looked up then, and the expression on her face nearly broke Graham's heart. It was raw recognition mixed with profound sorrow, the look of someone seeing a ghost of their own failure. Her eyes swept over Evan, taking in how much he'd grown, how much he'd changed, and tears spilled over before she could stop them. "Evan," she whispered. "Oh God, Evan. You grew up. You left," Evan said, and the accusation in those 2 words hung heavy in the air. He took a step forward, then another, the spiral notebook clutched against his chest like a shield. "You just disappeared. No goodbye. Nothing. I thought," his voice cracked. "I thought I did something wrong." Lena's face crumpled. She set the mug down on the coffee table with shaking hands and pressed her palms to her eyes, trying to stem the tears that wouldn't stop coming. "No," she said through her fingers. "No, sweetheart, no. You didn't do anything wrong. You were," she dropped her hands, looked directly at him with eyes full of pain. "You were the only thing I got right." Graham moved to the side, giving them space but staying close enough to intervene if needed. He felt like an intruder in this moment, watching something private unfold, but he couldn't leave. Wouldn't leave. Not until he understood. Evan crossed the room slowly, carefully, like approaching a wounded animal. He sat in the armchair across from Lena, the coffee table between them, close but not too close. Graham could see his son's hands trembling where they gripped the notebook. "Then why?" Evan asked, and his voice was younger now, vulnerable, the voice of a 13-year-old boy who'd lost his lifeline. "Why didn't you come back? Why didn't you at least tell me goodbye?" Lena took a shuddering breath, wiping her face with the corner of the blanket. When she spoke, her voice was steady but hollow, like someone reciting facts about someone else's life. "I was fired," she said. "On a Tuesday morning, right at shift change. 2 security guards came to the nurse's station, asked me to gather my things, and walked me out. I wasn't allowed to go back to patient rooms. Wasn't allowed to explain. They said if I tried to contact any patients or their families, they'd press charges for harassment." Graham felt his blood run cold. He moved closer, perching on the arm of the couch. "What were you accused of?" Lena's laugh was bitter, broken. "Negligence. Specifically, they said I'd failed to properly monitor a patient's vitals, leading to a critical incident that required emergency intervention. They said I'd falsified records to cover my mistake. That I'd endangered lives through incompetence." "That's insane," Evan said immediately, leaning forward. "You were the most careful nurse on that floor. You checked everything twice. He stopped, his face paling. "Wait. When did this happen?" "December 17th, Lena said quietly. 5 years ago." Evan's breath caught. Graham watched his son do the math, saw the moment understanding hit. "That was 2 days after my last panic attack," Evan said slowly. "The night you stayed late because I couldn't sleep. The night you," he stopped, swallowed hard. "What patient were they talking about? Who almost died?" Lena's silence was answer enough. Graham felt the floor tilt beneath him. "You," Graham breathed. They accused her of negligence with you. Lena nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. There was an incident that night. Your blood pressure dropped suddenly, not critically, but enough to trigger alarms. I was in the room with you immediately, called for backup, followed every protocol perfectly. The attending physician arrived within minutes, stabilized you, and you were fine within an hour. But the next morning, when I came in for my shift, they said the records showed I'd missed the initial warning signs, that I'd delayed calling for help, that I'd put you at risk. But that's not true, Evan said, his voice rising. You were right there. I remember waking up feeling weird and you were already checking the monitors. You called someone before I even understood what was happening. I know, Lena said softly. But the record said otherwise. They showed a 15-minute gap between when the alarm should have triggered and when I supposedly responded. And when I tried to explain, tried to show my own notes, they said I must have altered them afterward to protect myself. Graham's mind was racing now, pieces clicking together in ways that made his stomach turn. Who was the attending that night? Who stabilized Evan? Lena looked at him, and in her eyes Graham saw the answer before she spoke it. He felt the world narrow to a single point, felt everything he thought he knew begin to dissolve. Dr. Caleb Monroe, she said. The name hit Graham like a punch to the chest. Caleb. His best friend since college. His golf partner. His son's godfather. The man who'd held Graham's hand at his wife's funeral, who'd been there for every milestone, every crisis, every moment that mattered. The man who'd saved Evan's life, or so the story went. No, Graham said, but even as he said it, he knew. Deep down, in that place where truth lives before we're ready to face it, he knew. Lena was watching him carefully now, gauging his reaction. Dr. Monroe was the one who reported me. He said he'd reviewed the records and found inconsistencies. He said he had concerns about my competence. He testified at the hospital board meeting that I was a liability. Evan stood abruptly, pacing to the window, his breath fogging the glass. He visited me, he said quietly. After you left. He came by my room and asked how I was doing. Asked if I remembered that night, the night I got sick. I told him I remembered you being there, that you helped me. And Evan turned, his face twisted with realization. He said sometimes our memories play tricks on us when we're scared. He said trauma can make us remember things that didn't happen the way we think they did. Graham felt sick. He made you doubt your own memory. I was 13 and terrified, Evan said, his voice breaking. Everyone was telling me I almost died, that it was serious, that I was lucky someone caught it in time. And the doctor, your best friend, Dad, the guy I'd known my whole life, he was saying Lena made mistakes. So I started to think maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was remembering wrong. Maybe she wasn't as good as I thought she was. But you never forgot her, Lena said softly, looking at the notebook still clutched in Evan's hands. You kept writing. Because deep down I knew, Evan said fiercely. I knew the truth even when everyone was telling me it was a lie. You didn't leave me. You were taken from me. The room fell silent except for the storm and the fire. Graham stood, walked to the window where his son stood, looked out at the snow-covered landscape that looked peaceful and beautiful and utterly deceiving. His mind was working through scenarios, possibilities, motivations. Caleb wouldn't do this. Couldn't do this. There had to be an explanation. But even as he thought it, memories surfaced. Small things. Strange things. The way Caleb had discouraged him from asking too many questions about Evan's care. The way he'd steered Graham toward certain specialists and away from others. The generous donation he'd suggested Graham make to the hospital's new wing, a donation that had been made right around the time Lena was fired. Why? Graham asked, turning to Lena. Why would he do this to you? Lena stood, the blanket falling from her shoulders. She crossed to the fireplace, staring into the flames as if they held answers. "I saw something," she said quietly. "That night, when I was with Evan, when his blood pressure dropped. It wasn't random. It wasn't a complication from his injuries. Someone had adjusted his medication dosage wrong, specifically, they'd increased his sedative to a level that was dangerous given his other medications. It created an interaction that could have been serious if I hadn't caught it immediately." Graham's blood ran cold. "Who adjusted the medication?" Lena turned, and in the firelight her face looked ancient, haunted. "The order came from Dr. Monroe. I didn't think much of it at the time, he was the attending, he knew what he was doing. But when I checked Evan and saw the reaction, I looked at the chart more carefully. The dosage was wrong. Not just a little wrong. Dangerously wrong. And when I mentioned it to the night supervisor, suggested we flag it for review, everything went quiet. And then 48 hours later, I was gone. He tried to hurt me," Evan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Uncle Caleb tried to hurt me." "I don't think it was intentional," Lena said quickly. "I think it was a mistake, an oversight. But instead of owning it, instead of admitting the error and learning from it, he buried it. And he buried me with it." Graham sank into the nearest chair, his legs unable to hold him anymore. Caleb. His closest friend. A man he trusted with his son's life. A man who'd been in this house hundreds of times, who knew every detail of Graham's world, who'd been part of their family for 20 years. A man who destroyed an innocent woman's career to protect his own reputation. "I have copies," Lena said suddenly, urgently. "Of my notes from that night. I kept them. I knew something was wrong, even then. I knew I might need proof someday." She looked at Graham with desperate hope. "They're at a storage unit in Billings. Everything I managed to save before they cleaned out my locker." Graham looked up at her, this woman he'd found freezing at a bus stop, this woman who'd saved his son and lost everything. He thought about Caleb, about their friendship, about the empire they'd built together, because yes, Graham's company helped fund the hospital's expansion, and Caleb's reputation brought in donors and prestige. They were intertwined. Destroying one would damage the other. The choice should have been impossible. But looking at Evan's face, seeing the hope there, the desperate need for validation, for someone to finally believe him, Graham found the choice was actually very simple. "We'll get them," he said. "Tomorrow. First thing. And then we're going to find out exactly what happened." The storm broke sometime before dawn, leaving Riverton buried under 2 feet of fresh snow that glittered like diamonds in the weak winter sun. Graham stood at his kitchen window, watching the plows work their way down the highway, their yellow lights flashing against the white landscape. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Caleb's face, laughing at some joke, raising a glass at Graham's 40th birthday, crying at Sarah's funeral, holding newborn Evan with such tenderness that Graham had asked him to be godfather right there in the hospital room. How could that man be the same person who destroyed Lena's life? Behind him, he heard footsteps on the stairs. Evan appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing the same clothes from last night, his hair sticking up at odd angles. He looked like he hadn't slept either. "Is she still here?" Evan asked quietly. "Guest room," Graham said. "I checked on her an hour ago. She was actually sleeping." Evan nodded, moving to the coffee maker with the muscle memory of someone who'd grown up in this house. He started it brewing, the familiar sounds filling the kitchen, grinding beans, water heating, the first drips hitting the carafe. Normal sounds. As if this were a normal morning. "What are you going to do?" Evan asked, not looking at his father. Graham turned from the window. "What do you mean?" "About Uncle Caleb." Evan's hands gripped the counter. "Are you really going to confront him? Or are you going to protect him like you always do?" The accusation stung because it was true. Graham had always protected Caleb, made excuses for him, looked the other way when things didn't quite add up. The missed meetings that were blamed on emergencies. The donations to the hospital that always seemed to come with strings attached. The way Caleb always had an explanation for everything, smooth and practiced and impossible to argue with. "I'm going to find the truth," Graham said carefully. "That's all I can promise right now." "That's not good enough." Evan spun around, his eyes blazing. "She lost everything, Dad. Everything. Because he was too proud to admit he made a mistake. And you're talking about finding the truth like this is some business deal you need to research before committing." "Evan. No." His son's voice cracked. "You don't get it. She was the only person who made me feel human again. And he took that from me. He let me think I was going crazy, that my memories were wrong, that I couldn't trust my own mind. Do you know what that does to a kid? Do you know what it's been like living with that for 5 years?" Graham felt each word like a blade. "I should have seen it. I should have." "Yeah, you should have," Evan said flatly. "But you didn't. Because Caleb Monroe is your best friend, and best friends don't lie to each other, right? Except they do. And you chose to believe him instead of me." The coffee maker beeped, signaling it was done, but neither of them moved. Graham wanted to defend himself, to explain that he hadn't known, hadn't understood, but what was the point? Evan was right. When his son had retreated into silence, when he'd stopped engaging with the world, Graham had blamed trauma, blamed the accident, blamed everything except the possibility that someone close to them had caused it. "I'm sorry," Graham said, and the words felt inadequate, too small for the wound they were trying to heal. "I'm so sorry, Evan. I failed you." Evan's anger seemed to deflate, leaving exhaustion in its place. He slumped against the counter, suddenly looking much younger than 18. "I just need to know," he said quietly. "I need to know if what I remember is real. If she really was there for me. If I'm not," he stopped, swallowed hard. "If I'm not broken." "You're not broken," Graham said fiercely, crossing the kitchen to grip his son's shoulders. "You've never been broken. You're the strongest person I know." Before Evan could respond, they heard movement upstairs. Lena appeared at the top of the stairs moments later, wearing the same scrubs from last night, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked fragile in the morning light, but there was something different in her posture, a straightening of her spine, a lift to her chin. Hope, maybe. Or determination. "I'm coming with you," she said. "To Billings. To get the documents." Graham started to protest, but she cut him off. "This is my life we're talking about," she said firmly. "My career, my reputation, my future. I've spent 5 years running from this, hiding from it. I'm done running." They took Graham's Mercedes, the road still treacherous despite the plows. The drive to Billings normally took 2 hours, today it took almost 4. Nobody spoke much. Lena sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the snow-covered plains, occasionally giving directions. Evan sat in the back, earbuds in but no music playing, lost in his own thoughts. Graham's mind kept returning to Caleb. He needed to talk to him, needed to give him a chance to explain before this went any further. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe Lena had misunderstood something. Maybe. But even as he thought it, he knew he was making excuses again. Protecting his friend instead of facing the truth. The storage facility was on the outskirts of Billings, a grim collection of orange metal units behind a chain-link fence. Lena led them to Unit 247, her hands shaking as she worked the combination lock. Inside was a collection of cardboard boxes, a few pieces of furniture, a life packed away and forgotten. She pulled out a specific box, marked simply, Work, 2019. Inside were folders, meticulously organized despite the chaos of her departure. She found what she was looking for, a manila folder, worn at the edges, containing photocopies of medical charts, medication orders, and her own handwritten notes from that December night. "Here," she said, handing it to Graham. Everything's in there. The original medication order from Dr. Monroe. My notes documenting the reaction. The corrected dosage. The timeline showing I responded immediately. Graham opened the folder with trembling hands. The documents were technical, full of medical jargon he didn't fully understand, but the timeline was clear. Lena's notes were time-stamped, detailed, professional. And there, on the medication order, was Caleb's signature with a dosage that even Graham could see was wrong, the numbers crossed out and corrected in different ink, a detail that would have been easy to miss unless you were looking for it. He changed it, Graham said slowly. After the incident. He altered the original order to make it look like he'd prescribed the correct dosage, and then made it seem like you'd made the error in administration. That's my theory, Lena said quietly. I think he realized his mistake after I caught it, panicked, and decided to make it disappear. And the easiest way to do that was to make me disappear instead. Evan had moved closer, reading over Graham's shoulder. This is fraud, he said. This is evidence of medical malpractice and fraud. Which is why he went so hard to get rid of me, Lena said. If this had gone to any kind of formal review, if anyone had looked closely at the records, they would have seen the alterations. But by making it about my competence, by making me the problem, he controlled the narrative. Graham closed the folder, his mind made up. We need to confront him. Today. With this evidence. Are you sure? Lena asked, and there was fear in her eyes. Graham, he's powerful. He has connections. If he destroyed me once, he can do it again. Not if I'm standing with you, Graham said. Not if we have proof. They drove back to Riverton in tense silence, the folder sitting on Lena's lap like a bomb waiting to explode. Graham called Caleb from the car, keeping his voice casual, asking if he could stop by the hospital for a quick conversation. Caleb agreed immediately, his voice warm and unsuspecting, asking if everything was okay, if Evan was all right. The ease of his lies made Graham's stomach turn. The hospital was quiet on the day after Christmas, skeleton staff working the holiday shift. Caleb's office was on the 4th floor, overlooking the parking lot. Graham had been here hundreds of times, celebrating grants, discussing expansions, drinking expensive scotch and planning the future. Today, it felt like walking into enemy territory. Caleb stood when they entered, his smile bright and genuine until he saw Lena behind Graham. Then something flickered across his face, just for a moment, so quick Graham almost missed it. Recognition. And fear. Graham, Caleb said slowly, his smile frozen in place. This is unexpected. I didn't know we were having a group meeting. We need to talk, Graham said, closing the door behind them. About 5 years ago. About Evan's care. About a nurse named Lena Cross. Caleb's face went carefully blank. I don't understand what. Yes, you do, Graham said quietly, placing the folder on Caleb's desk. You understand exactly what this is about. The silence that followed was suffocating. Caleb looked at the folder, at Lena, at Evan standing rigid by the door, and then finally at Graham. And in his old friend's eyes, Graham saw it, the calculation, the assessment of how much damage had been done, how much could still be controlled. Graham, Caleb said carefully. Whatever she's told you, whatever narrative she's constructed, you need to understand that this woman was terminated for cause. For incompetence. I tried to help her, tried to give her chances to improve, but... Open the folder, Graham interrupted. Caleb's hand moved to it slowly, reluctantly. He opened it, scanned the first page, and Graham watched the color drain from his face. Where did you get these? Caleb whispered. She kept copies, Graham said. Because she knew. She knew what you'd done. Caleb looked up, and for the first time in 20 years of friendship, Graham didn't recognize the man in front of him. This wasn't the friend who'd stood beside him through everything. This was a stranger wearing a familiar face. Graham, listen to me, Caleb said, his voice taking on a pleading edge. It was a mistake. A simple mistake. I was exhausted, working a double shift, and I miscalculated the dosage. It happens. But if it had come out, if there had been an investigation, it would have destroyed everything. The hospital's reputation, your investment, the new wing. So you destroyed her instead, Evan said from the doorway, his voice shaking with fury. Caleb's eyes cut to Evan, and Graham saw him realize for the first time how much damage he'd really done. Caleb's face had gone from pale to ashen, his hands gripping the edge of his mahogany desk like a drowning man clutching driftwood. The office suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in, the expensive diplomas and awards on the walls transforming from achievements into accusations. Graham watched his oldest friend struggle for words, watching him realize that 20 years of carefully constructed lies were crumbling in real time. Evan, Caleb started, his voice cracking. You have to understand, I never meant to hurt you. You were like a nephew to me. I was trying to help, trying to manage your pain, and he stopped, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. I made a calculation error. A simple mistake. A simple mistake that almost killed me, Evan said, his voice deadly quiet. He stepped forward, away from the door, and Graham could see his son's entire body trembling with rage barely held in check. A simple mistake that you covered up by destroying the one person who actually cared about me. The one person who made me feel like I mattered. That's not fair, Caleb said, but there was no conviction in his words. I cared about you. I've always cared about you. You cared about yourself, Lena spoke for the first time since entering the office, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. You cared about your reputation, your career, your standing in the medical community. I was convenient collateral damage. Caleb's eyes fixed on her, and for a moment Graham saw something flicker there, guilt, maybe, or shame, but it was quickly replaced by desperation. Lena, if you'd just accepted the severance package, if you'd signed the non-disclosure agreement, none of this would have been necessary. You could have moved on, started over somewhere else. I couldn't sign it, Lena said, her voice breaking. Because it would have meant admitting I was negligent. It would have meant accepting that I failed Evan and every other patient who trusted me. I couldn't do that. I wouldn't. So instead you lost everything, Caleb said, and there was something cruel in his tone now, something sharp and ugly. Your job, your license, your marriage. Was your pride really worth all that? The question hung in the air like poison gas. Graham felt his hands curl into fists, felt a rage building in his chest that he'd never experienced before, not even when Sarah died, not even during the darkest moments of Evan's recovery. This was different. This was watching someone he trusted reveal themselves as a monster. It wasn't pride, Graham said quietly, and his voice cut through the tension like a blade. It was integrity. Something you seem to have forgotten the meaning of. Caleb turned to him, and Graham saw panic in his old friend's eyes. Graham, please. Think about what you're doing. Think about what this will mean. Not just for me, but for you. Your company funded the hospital expansion. Your name is on that building. If this comes out, if there's an investigation, they'll look at everything. Every donation, every board decision, every connection between us. They'll tear apart everything we've built. And there it was. The threat wrapped in concern. The reminder of what Graham had to lose. Graham thought about his empire, the tech company he'd built from nothing, the investments, the board seats, the respect of the business community. He thought about the Whitlock name on the hospital's new cancer center, the foundation he'd created in Sarah's memory. He thought about the life he'd carefully constructed, the reputation he'd spent decades building. Then he looked at Evan, standing there with tears running down his face, his hands shaking, his entire world having been validated after 5 years of doubt. He looked at Lena, who'd lost everything because she'd refused to lie. And he looked at Caleb, his best friend, the man he'd trusted with his son's life, who was now threatening him to protect a lie. The choice should have been impossible. But somehow, it was the easiest decision Graham had ever made. Let them look, Graham said. Let them tear it all apart. Because I'd rather lose everything I own than look my son in the eye and tell him that money matters more than truth. Caleb's face went slack with shock. You can't be serious. Graham, we've been friends for 20 years. I was at your wedding. I held your hand when Sarah died. I'm Evan's godfather, for God's sake. And you almost killed him, Graham said, his voice rising now, years of suppressed emotion breaking through. You made a mistake that could have cost me my son, and instead of owning it, instead of being honest, you destroyed an innocent woman's life. You looked me in the eye for 5 years and lied. You watched Evan struggle and said nothing. You let me thank you for saving him when you were the reason he needed saving in the first place. I did save him. Caleb shouted, slamming his hand on the desk. If I hadn't been there, if I hadn't caught the interaction in time. You didn't catch it, Lena interrupted, her voice cold and clear. I did. I saw the reaction, I called for help, I corrected the dosage before it became critical. You showed up after I'd already stabilized him. And then you took credit for my work while simultaneously destroying my career. The office door opened suddenly, and a woman in scrubs poked her head in. Dr. Monroe? Is everything okay? We heard shouting. Everything's fine, Sandra, Caleb said quickly, his professional mask sliding back into place with practiced ease. Just a private discussion. Please close the door. The nurse hesitated, her eyes sweeping over the scene, Graham's rigid posture, Evan's tear-stained face, Lena's presence, Caleb's barely controlled panic. But years of hospital hierarchy won out, and she closed the door without another word. The interruption seemed to give Caleb a moment to regroup. When he spoke again, his voice was calmer, more calculated. Graham, let's be rational about this. Yes, I made mistakes. Yes, I handled the situation poorly. But destroying both our lives won't change what happened. It won't give Lena back the last 5 years. It won't erase Evan's trauma. All it will do is create more damage, more pain, more victims. So what are you suggesting? Graham asked coldly. That we cover this up. That we let you continue practicing medicine, making life and death decisions, knowing you're willing to sacrifice patients and colleagues to protect yourself. I'm suggesting we find a solution that works for everyone, Caleb said, and now his voice took on the smooth, persuasive quality Graham had heard him use with donors and board members. Lena, we can restore your license. Quietly. We can provide financial compensation for the years you lost. We can write recommendations that will get you hired anywhere you want. We can fix this. In exchange for what? Lena asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. In exchange for discretion, Caleb said. We keep this between us. No investigations, no public scandal, no media attention. Everyone gets what they want. Lena gets her career back. Evan gets closure. Graham protects his legacy. And he paused, choosing his words carefully. I learn from my mistakes and move forward. Graham watched Lena's face, saw the war happening there. It was a good offer. More than good. It was everything she'd lost, everything she'd spent 5 years grieving, handed back to her on a silver platter. All she had to do was stay silent. No, Lena said quietly. Caleb blinked. What? No, she repeated, stronger now. I won't take your money. I won't sign your agreements. I won't help you bury this. Lena, think about what you're saying, Caleb urged, leaning forward. This is your chance to get your life back. Don't throw it away out of spite. It's not spite, Lena said, and there was steel in her voice now, a strength Graham hadn't heard before. It's about the next nurse you'll throw under the bus when it's convenient. It's about the next patient whose life you'll risk to protect your ego. It's about every person who's trusted you and had that trust betrayed. She stood, pulling herself to her full height. I lost everything because I refused to lie about what I saw. I'm not going to start lying now. Evan moved to stand beside her, and Graham felt a surge of pride watching his son square his shoulders and face the man who'd been a fixture in his life since birth. You taught me about integrity, Uncle Caleb, Evan said, and the title now sounded like an insult. You told me that character is what you do when nobody's watching. You said that a man's word is his bond, that reputation takes years to build and seconds to destroy. Funny how none of that applied to you. Caleb's composure finally cracked completely. Your children, he spat. Both of you. You have no idea how the real world works. You think truth and justice and integrity matter. They don't. Power matters. Money matters. And Graham knows that. Don't you, Graham? You didn't build an empire by being honest. You did it by being smart, by making hard choices, by protecting what's yours. Graham moved around the desk slowly, deliberately, until he was standing directly in front of Caleb. They were the same height, had always been equals, had stood shoulder to shoulder through everything. But in this moment, Graham felt like he was looking down at something small and pathetic. You're right, Graham said quietly. I did make hard choices. I did protect what's mine. And what's mine, what's always been mine, is my son. And I failed to protect him from you. He picked up the folder from Caleb's desk, held it up between them. These copies go to the medical board tomorrow morning, Graham said. Along with a formal complaint from Lena requesting a full investigation into her termination. I'll be providing a statement about Evan's care and the circumstances surrounding his hospitalization. And I'll be requesting a complete audit of the hospital's practices and procedures during your tenure as Chief of Staff. Caleb's face had gone from ashen to red, fury and fear warring for dominance. You'll regret this. I promise you, Graham, you'll regret this. When the board comes after you, when the lawyers start digging into every business deal you've ever made with the hospital, when your precious reputation is dragged through the mud alongside mine, you'll wish you'd taken the easy way out. Maybe, Graham said. But at least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror. Can you say the same? He turned and walked to the door, Lena and Evan following. His hand was on the handle when Caleb spoke one last time, his voice breaking. I loved you like a brother, Graham. I loved your family. How can you throw away 20 years of friendship over this? Graham paused, looked back over his shoulder at the man he trusted more than anyone except his late wife. The man who'd held his newborn son. The man who'd been there for every milestone, every triumph, every tragedy. And felt absolutely nothing except a hollow sadness for what had never really been there in the first place. You threw it away, Graham said quietly. The moment you chose your reputation over my son's life. The moment you destroyed Lena to save yourself. I'm just finally seeing what you've been all along. He opened the door and walked out, his son and Lena beside him, leaving Caleb alone in his office surrounded by his accomplishments and his lies. The three of them sat in Graham's car in the hospital parking lot for 20 minutes before anyone spoke. Snow had started falling again, light flurries that danced in the wind and clung to the windshield. Graham's hands gripped the steering wheel even though the engine wasn't running, his knuckles white, his breathing shallow. He could feel Evan watching him from the back seat, could sense Lena's quiet presence beside him, but he couldn't move. Couldn't think. Couldn't process what he'd just done. He'd just declared war on his best friend. On his business partner. On a man whose connections ran so deep in Montana's medical and social circles that one phone call could unravel everything Graham had spent his life building. Dad? Evan's voice was small, uncertain. Are you okay? The question was absurd. Nothing was okay. Nothing would ever be okay again. But Graham forced himself to nod, to turn the key in the ignition, to pull out of the parking lot like this was just another day, just another difficult conversation, just another problem to be managed. They drove home in silence. The house felt different when they walked in, colder somehow, despite the heat running, as if the confrontation with Caleb had opened a door to something dark and hungry that was now following them home. Graham went straight to his office, Lena disappeared upstairs, and Evan stood in the foyer looking lost, like a child who'd witnessed something he wasn't supposed to see. Graham sat at his desk, the one Sarah had given him when his company went public, and stared at the phone. He needed to make calls. Needed to get ahead of this. Caleb wouldn't wait, he'd be on the phone right now, calling board members, calling investors, calling every person they knew in common to control the narrative before Graham could. But Graham couldn't make himself pick up the phone. Because once he did, once he started down this path, there was no going back. He'd be choosing Lena's truth over Caleb's lies. He'd be choosing justice over loyalty. He'd be choosing to blow up his entire world on the word of a woman he'd met less than 48 hours ago. The knock on his office door was soft, hesitant. "Come in," Graham said, his voice rough. Evan entered, closing the door behind him. He'd changed into fresh clothes but still looked exhausted, hollowed out. He sat in the chair across from Graham's desk, the chair where so many important conversations had happened over the years, where they'd talked about college applications and Sarah's illness and the future, and for a long moment, father and son just looked at each other. "You're having second thoughts," Evan said. Not a question. A statement. Graham wanted to deny it, but what was the point of lying now? Yes. About Lena? About whether she's telling the truth? No, Graham said immediately. The evidence is clear. She's telling the truth. Caleb is guilty of everything she's accused him of. Then what? Evan leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. What are you doubting? Graham stood, walked to the window overlooking the snow-covered forest behind his house. I'm doubting whether destroying everything is worth it. Whether justice is worth the price we're all going to pay. The silence that followed was so heavy Graham could feel it pressing against his chest. When Evan finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. Do you remember the night Mom died? The question hit Graham like a physical blow. He turned, found Evan watching him with eyes that looked too old, too knowing. Of course I remember. Do you remember what you told me? When I asked you why God would let her suffer like that, why she had to die when we needed her so much. Graham's throat tightened. He remembered. Sarah had been gone less than an hour, her body still warm in the hospital bed, and Evan, 13 years old, the same age he'd been during the accident, had looked at Graham with devastation in his eyes and asked questions that had no good answers. I told you that some things don't have reasons we can understand, Graham said slowly. That sometimes life is just cruel and unfair, and all we can do is hold on to each other and keep going. That's not all you said. Evan stood, moved to stand beside his father at the window. You said that Mom lived her whole life trying to do what was right, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. And that the best way to honor her was to do the same. To choose what's right over what's easy. Graham closed his eyes, remembering Sarah's face, remembering her conviction, her unwavering moral compass that he'd both admired and sometimes resented. She'd never understood compromise, never understood the gray areas where Graham lived his business life. She'd seen things in black and white, right and wrong, truth and lies. She would have exposed Caleb the moment she suspected something was wrong. She wouldn't have waited, wouldn't have doubted, wouldn't have worried about the consequences. She would be disappointed in me, Graham whispered. For hesitating. For even considering protecting him. Maybe, Evan said. But she's not here to be disappointed. I am. And Dad, his voice cracked. Dad, I need you to choose me this time. Not your business. Not your reputation. Not your friendship with Uncle Caleb. Me. I need you to choose me. The words broke something inside Graham. He turned to his son, saw the tears streaming down Evan's face, saw all the years of hurt and confusion and self-doubt written there, and realized that this moment, right here, right now, was the most important decision of his life. More important than any business deal. More important than any friendship. More important than the empire he'd built. I almost lost you once, Graham said, his own voice breaking. In that accident. And then again when you stopped talking, when you went somewhere I couldn't reach. And I've spent 5 years thinking we made it through, thinking you were okay, not realizing you've been carrying this weight the whole time. I thought I was crazy, Evan whispered. I thought maybe my memories were wrong, maybe I'd built her up in my head, maybe she wasn't as good as I remembered. And that made me doubt everything. Every memory. Every feeling. Everything I thought I knew about myself. Graham pulled his son into a hug, feeling Evan collapse against him the way he used to when he was small, before the world got complicated and scary. You're not crazy. Your memories were real. She was exactly as good as you remembered. And I'm sorry, God, Evan, I'm so sorry, that I didn't see it. That I didn't fight for the truth when it mattered most. They stood there, holding each other as the snow fell outside and the afternoon light faded. Finally, Evan pulled back, wiping his face with his sleeve. So what now? He asked. Are you really going to go through with it? Even knowing what it might cost? Graham thought about his company, his investments, his reputation. He thought about the board meetings and the phone calls and the legal battles that would consume the next months or years of his life. He thought about Caleb's threats, about investigations and audits and everything being dragged into the light. And then he thought about Lena, sitting alone upstairs, waiting to find out if Graham was going to choose expediency over truth. He thought about all the other nurses and patients and people who might be hurt if Caleb continued practicing medicine unchecked. He thought about the kind of man he wanted to be, the kind of father he wanted to be, the legacy he wanted to leave that had nothing to do with money or buildings with his name on them. Yes, Graham said firmly. I'm going through with it. Tomorrow morning, I'm taking Lena's evidence to the medical board. I'm filing a formal complaint. And then I'm calling a press conference to explain exactly why I'm withdrawing my support from the hospital and demanding a full investigation. Evan's face transformed, relief and pride and hope flooding in where fear had been. They're going to come after you. Caleb, the hospital board, maybe even your own company's investors. Let them, Graham said. I've spent my whole life building things, businesses, relationships, reputation. Maybe it's time I focused on building something that actually matters. Like trust with my son. Like being someone you can be proud of. I'm already proud of you, Evan said quietly. For this. For choosing right over easy. There was a soft knock on the door, and Lena poked her head in. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was something different in her expression, a tentative hope she'd been afraid to show before. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said. But I heard voices and I wanted to. She stopped, looking between Graham and Evan. I wanted to tell you that if you've changed your mind, if this is too much, I understand. I can leave tonight. I can take the evidence and pursue this on my own. You don't have to sacrifice everything for me. Graham crossed the room, took her hands in his. They were warm now, no longer the purple, frozen things he'd found at the bus stop, and somehow that detail mattered more than anything else. You're not leaving, he said firmly. And I'm not sacrificing anything. I'm finally doing what I should have done 5 years ago, standing up for what's right, consequences be damned. Lena's face crumpled, fresh tears spilling over. I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to thank me, Graham said. You saved my son twice, once in that hospital, and again by being brave enough to show up here, to tell the truth even when it cost you everything. The least I can do is stand beside you when you need someone in your corner. Evan joined them, the three of them standing together in the fading light of Graham's office. A father, a son, and the woman who'd connected them across 5 years of silence and lies. Tomorrow would bring battles and consequences and pain. But tonight, in this moment, they were united. They were strong. They were choosing truth over comfort, justice over convenience, integrity over ease. And somehow, despite everything, that felt like enough. "There's something else," Lena said softly. "Something I need you both to know before we do this. Once we go public, once this becomes official, they're going to dig into every part of my life. And they're going to find things. Mistakes I made. Reasons to doubt me. Ammunition Caleb can use to discredit me." "Like what?" Graham asked. "Like the fact that I lost my license not just because of the hospital's accusations, but because I was too broken to fight properly. Like the fact that my marriage fell apart and I lost custody of my daughter because I couldn't hold myself together afterward. Like the fact that I've been living in my car for the past 3 months because I couldn't afford rent and I was too proud to ask for help." She looked at both of them, her chin lifted despite the shame in her eyes. "I'm not a perfect victim. I'm not someone who handled everything with grace and dignity. I fell apart. And they're going to use that against us." Graham squeezed her hands. "Then we'll deal with it. Together. Because falling apart after being betrayed doesn't make you weak, Lena. It makes you human. And I'll testify to that myself if I have to." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and Graham realized that this, right here, was what Sarah would have wanted. Not the empire. Not the reputation. But this moment of choosing compassion and truth and standing with someone who needed it, regardless of the cost. Tomorrow, they would face the consequences. Tonight, they had each other. And that would have to be enough. The morning after Christmas dawned cold and bright, the kind of Montana winter day that made the snow sparkle like it held pieces of broken sky. Graham had been awake since 4, sitting at his kitchen table with documents spread out in front of him, a cold cup of coffee forgotten at his elbow. He'd drafted and redrafted his statement 7 times, each version more direct than the last, until the words were stripped down to brutal, unadorned truth. By 7 a.m., he was standing in the offices of the Montana Board of Medical Examiners in Helena, Lena beside him, handing over copies of her evidence to a stone-faced administrator who promised a thorough review. By 9, he'd sent a formal letter to the hospital board announcing his immediate withdrawal of all financial support and demanding Caleb's suspension pending investigation. By 10, he was standing in front of a hastily assembled group of reporters in a conference room at the Riverton Community Center, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward like weapons. "My name is Graham Whitlock," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "And I'm here today to expose a pattern of medical malpractice, fraud, and retaliation that has been covered up for 5 years by someone I considered my closest friend." The room erupted. Questions shouted over each other, reporters scrambling to take notes. But Graham kept talking, laying out the timeline methodically: Evan's hospitalization, the medication error, Lena's termination, the falsified records, the cover-up. He showed copies of the documents, explained the evidence, and when asked why he was coming forward now, he looked directly into the cameras and said the words that would define everything that followed. "Because my son spent 5 years doubting his own memories, thinking he was broken, carrying trauma that wasn't his to carry. Because a good nurse lost everything for telling the truth. And because I was too blind, too loyal, and too comfortable to see what was happening right in front of me. I failed them both. And I won't fail them again." By noon, the story had exploded across local news. By evening, national outlets had picked it up: wealthy CEO exposes best friend's medical malpractice, risking his own empire for justice. The hospital's phones were ringing off the hook. The medical board announced an emergency investigation. And Caleb Monroe's attorney released a statement calling the allegations unfounded and malicious, while threatening legal action for defamation. Graham's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Board members from his company. Investors. Business partners. All asking the same questions: was this true? Why now? What was he thinking? His CFO left a voicemail saying 3 major investors were threatening to pull out. His attorney called to warn him about the legal exposure he'd just created for himself. Graham deleted every message without listening to the end. That night, sitting in his living room with Evan and Lena, he watched the evening news coverage. The story had taken on a life of its own. Reporters had found other nurses from the hospital willing to speak off the record about the culture of fear, about incidents that were buried, about Dr. Monroe's reputation for never being wrong even when he clearly was. "They're calling you a hero," Evan said quietly, watching his father's face on the screen. "I'm not a hero," Graham said, exhausted. "Heroes act when it matters, not 5 years too late." "You're acting now," Lena said softly. "That matters." The next morning brought consequences. Graham woke to find his company's stock had dropped 12% overnight. By afternoon, the board had called an emergency meeting. Graham attended via video conference, watching faces he'd known for years turn cold and calculating as they discussed his recent erratic behavior and whether he was fit to continue as CEO. "You've put this company at significant legal and financial risk," the chairman said, his tone clipped and professional. "Your personal vendetta against Dr. Monroe has created liability issues we can't ignore." "It's not a vendetta," Graham said evenly. "It's the truth. Truth or not, you should have consulted with the board before going public. You should have let our legal team handle this. Instead, you acted unilaterally and now we're all paying the price." Graham looked at the faces on the screen, men and women he'd worked with for years, who'd celebrated successes and weathered failures, who'd sent cards when Sarah died and gifts when Evan was born. And realized that not one of them was asking if the allegations were true. Not one of them cared about justice or accountability. They only cared about the bottom line. "Then I'll make this easy for you," Graham said. "I resign as CEO, effective immediately." The stunned silence that followed was almost comical. The chairman recovered first. "Graham, let's not be hasty. We can work through this." "No," Graham interrupted. "We can't. Because you want me to choose between my integrity and my position, and I choose integrity. I choose my son. I choose truth. And if that makes me unfit to run this company, then so be it." He closed the laptop before anyone could respond. The days that followed were brutal. The hospital filed a lawsuit against Graham for defamation and tortious interference. Caleb's attorney went on television calling Lena an opportunist and Graham a man having a breakdown after years of grief. Former friends stopped returning calls. Invitations to events were quietly rescinded. The Whitlock name, which had opened doors for decades, suddenly became something people whispered about, something tainted. But other things happened too. The medical board's investigation uncovered 2 other incidents where Caleb had made errors and blamed subordinates. 3 former nurses came forward with similar stories of being terminated or forced out after questioning his decisions. A patient's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit claiming their mother had died due to medication errors that were covered up. The foundation Graham had built was crumbling. But in its place, something else was emerging: truth, accountability, justice for people who'd been silenced. 2 weeks after the press conference, Graham was in his kitchen making dinner, something he'd started doing again, cooking meals for himself and Evan and Lena, who was still staying in the guest room while her license was being reviewed, when his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. "Mr. Whitlock. This is Jennifer Marsh from the Montana Board of Medical Examiners. I wanted to inform you personally that Dr. Monroe's medical license has been suspended pending the outcome of our full investigation. Additionally, we're reviewing Ms. Cross's case and it appears there were significant procedural violations in her termination. We expect to have her license restored within 60 days. Graham sat down heavily, the phone pressed to his ear. "Thank you," he managed. "No, Mr. Whitlock. Thank you. What you did took courage. And it's going to save lives." When he hung up, Lena was standing in the doorway, her face cautiously hopeful. "What was that about?" "They suspended Caleb's license," Graham said. "And they're restoring yours." She made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob, her hand coming up to cover her mouth. Evan appeared behind her, and the three of them stood there in the kitchen as the evening light faded, processing what this meant. Justice. Validation. The beginning of something new. "I got a job offer today," Lena said quietly. "A small clinic in Red Lodge. It's not much, just basic primary care, nothing like the hospital, but they said they'd hold the position until my license is reinstated." "That's amazing," Evan said, but there was something sad in his voice, something that sounded like goodbye. "It's 2 hours away," Lena said, looking at Graham. "I'd have to move. Start over again." "But Graham," her voice broke. "I can't keep living in your guest room. You've done so much already, given up so much. I can't keep taking from you." Graham thought about the empire he'd lost, the friendships that had dissolved, the reputation that would take years to rebuild if it ever could be. He thought about the money he'd spent on lawyers, the stress that had carved new lines into his face, the sleepless nights wondering if he'd made the right choice. And then he thought about Evan, who smiled now, who talked openly, who'd started seeing a therapist to work through the trauma he'd carried alone for too long. He thought about the other nurses who'd come forward, freed by Graham's decision to speak up. He thought about future patients who'd be protected because one man chose truth over comfort. "You're not taking anything from me," Graham said. "You're giving me the chance to be the person I should have been all along." "Still," Lena said, "I need to build my own life. I need to prove to myself that I can." "Then take the job," Graham said. "Build your life. Be amazing. But know that you'll always have a home here. Both of you," he looked at Evan. "You've become family. And family doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient." That night, after Lena had gone upstairs and Evan had retreated to his room, Graham stood at his window looking out at the snow-covered forest. His phone buzzed, a news alert. The hospital had announced Caleb Monroe's resignation and a comprehensive review of all cases he'd handled in the past decade. 3 board members had also resigned. The scandal was far from over. But Graham felt something he hadn't felt in years. Maybe ever. Peace. The kind that comes from knowing you did the right thing, regardless of the cost. The kind that lets you sleep at night. The kind that means something when you look in the mirror. He'd lost an empire. But he'd found himself. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. 6 months had passed since that Christmas night, and the world looked different now, smaller in some ways, larger in others. Graham stood in the parking lot of the Red Lodge Community Clinic, a modest building with faded blue siding and a hand-painted sign that had seen better days. His Mercedes felt out of place here, too expensive, too showy for a town where most people drove pickup trucks with more rust than paint. He'd driven 2 hours through winding mountain roads to get here, leaving before dawn, watching the sun rise over the Beartooth Mountains and paint the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold. Evan was back at college now, University of Montana, studying psychology because he wanted to help other kids who felt broken and alone. He called every Sunday, and they talked for hours, real conversations about real things, not the careful dance they'd performed for years. Graham's life had changed in ways he was still processing. The company had moved on without him, appointing a new CEO who'd immediately begun distancing the brand from the scandal. Graham's stock had lost considerable value, but he still had enough to live comfortably for several lifetimes. More importantly, he'd started a foundation, the Sarah Whitlock Foundation for Medical Ethics and Patient Advocacy. It was small, just him and 2 employees working out of a rented office in Billings, but they'd already helped 3 healthcare workers fight wrongful terminations and funded legal representation for 2 families pursuing malpractice claims. The work wasn't glamorous. It didn't come with board meetings or stock options or his name on buildings. But it mattered. Every day, it mattered. The clinic's front door opened, and Lena emerged, wearing scrubs with cartoon penguins on them, a stethoscope around her neck, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She looked healthier than she had that Christmas night, color in her cheeks, light in her eyes, the haunted quality replaced by something Graham could only describe as contentment. She saw his car and stopped, surprise flashing across her face before transforming into a warm smile. She walked over, and Graham got out to meet her. "Graham," she said, and there was genuine pleasure in her voice. "What are you doing here? Is Evan okay?" "Evan's fine," Graham assured her. "Better than fine, actually. He made Dean's List last semester. He's been volunteering at a crisis hotline for teenagers. Graham's voice caught. "He's healing." Lena's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "That's wonderful. God, that's so wonderful." "I came because I wanted to see you," Graham said. "To see how you're doing. You've been hard to pin down for a visit." "I know, I'm sorry," Lena said, looking embarrassed. "It's just been so busy here. We're the only clinic for 3 counties, and we're chronically understaffed. I've been working 60-hour weeks just to keep up with patient load." Graham looked at the building, noticing details now: the cracked window in the waiting room, the faded paint, the parking lot with more potholes than pavement. "Lena, this place is falling apart, I know," she said with a rueful laugh. "The funding is barely enough to keep the lights on. We can't afford to hire more staff, and half our equipment is older than me. But Graham, the work we do here," her face lit up. "We serve people who have nowhere else to go. Uninsured families, elderly folks on fixed incomes, people who drive 2 hours to Billings for care they can't afford. We're it for them. We're the only option." "Then the clinic needs more funding," Graham said simply. Lena's expression changed, became wary. "Graham, no. You've done enough. You've given up enough." "I haven't given up anything that mattered," Graham said. "And I'm not offering charity. I'm offering partnership. My foundation focuses on patient advocacy and medical ethics. This clinic embodies both. You're providing care to vulnerable populations, and you're doing it with integrity. That's exactly what we're trying to support." "Graham. Just listen," he said gently. "What if we could hire 2 more nurses? A part-time physician to take some of the load off you and Dr. Chen? What if we could upgrade your equipment, fix the building, create a sustainable model that doesn't require you to work yourself to exhaustion?" Lena was shaking her head, but Graham could see the hope warring with fear in her eyes. "Why? Why would you do this?" "Because you saved my son," Graham said simply. "Twice. And because I've spent 6 months trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life, and I think maybe I'm supposed to spend it making sure people like you don't have to fight alone anymore." A car pulled into the parking lot, and a woman emerged holding a small child who was clearly sick, the kind of desperate exhaustion in her face that spoke of sleepless nights and worry that wouldn't quit. Lena's entire demeanor changed instantly, shifting into nurse mode. "I have to," she started. "Go," Graham said. "I'll wait." He watched her hurry over to the woman, saw her crouch down to the child's level, speaking softly, her hands gentle as she checked the little girl's forehead. The mother's shoulders sagged with relief just from Lena's presence, from being seen and helped and cared for. This was what Lena did: she made people feel like they mattered, like their pain was important, like they deserved care and dignity. Just like she'd done for Evan all those years ago. Graham waited in his car, making phone calls, checking emails, watching patients come and go from the clinic. Young families. Elderly couples. A teenager who looked scared and alone. Each one was greeted by Lena or one of the other staff with warmth and professionalism, despite the long wait times and cramped conditions. 3 hours later, as the sun was starting to dip toward the mountains, Lena finally emerged again. She looked exhausted, her scrub stained, her hair falling out of its ponytail. But she was smiling. "Sorry," she said, sliding into Graham's passenger seat when he gestured for her to join him. "Mondays are always crazy." "Don't apologize," Graham said. "I got to witness something amazing." "Do you know what you've built here?" "It's not much." "It's everything," Graham interrupted. Lena, I've spent my career building companies, accumulating wealth, chasing success. And none of it, has felt as meaningful as what I saw today. You're changing lives. You're giving people hope. You're doing exactly what you were meant to do. Lena looked down at her hands, worn and tired from a long day's work. I just wish I could do more. There are so many people we have to turn away because we don't have capacity. So many needs we can't meet. Then let me help, Graham said. Not as charity. Not as repayment. But as partnership. Let me use the resources I have to amplify the work you're doing. Let me be part of something that actually matters. Lena was quiet for a long moment, watching the last few patients leave the clinic, the lights inside dimming as the staff prepared to close for the day. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. Do you remember what you said to me that night? When you found me at the bus stop? I said a lot of things. You said, "You come with me," Lena interrupted softly. Not as a question. As a statement. Like you'd already decided I was worth saving, even though you didn't know anything about me. Graham nodded, remembering that night, the way she'd looked so small and lost and ready to give up. I've thought about that moment every day since, Lena continued. Because nobody had looked at me like that in years. Like I was a person who deserved help, not a problem to be managed or a liability to be erased. You saw me, Graham. When I was invisible to everyone else, you saw me. You made it easy, Graham said. You're impossible not to see. Lena laughed, wiping her eyes. I was freezing to death in scrubs with teddy bears on them. I was at my absolute lowest. And you still, she stopped, took a breath. You still chose to help. Even when it cost you everything. It didn't cost me everything, Graham said firmly. It cost me things I thought mattered, money, status, false friendships. But it gave me back what actually matters. My relationship with my son. My integrity. A sense of purpose. You didn't take anything from me, Lena. You gave me back myself. The sun had fully set now, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Inside the clinic, the last light went out, and Graham saw Lena's colleague, Dr. Chen, presumably, lock the front door and head to his car with the same exhausted but satisfied expression Lena wore. If I say yes, Lena said quietly. If I let you help the clinic, let you become part of this, you have to promise me something. Anything. Promise me you won't try to fix everything. Promise me you'll let this be messy and imperfect and real. Because that's what healthcare is for people like us. It's not sterile hospitals and million-dollar equipment. It's showing up every day and doing the best we can with what we have and knowing it's never quite enough but it's still worth doing. Graham smiled, understanding washing over him. I promise. No fixing. Just supporting. Just being present. Lena extended her hand, and Graham shook it, feeling the calluses from years of hard work, the strength in her grip despite her small frame. Partners, then, she said. Partners, Graham agreed. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the stars multiply overhead. Then Lena spoke again, her voice softer now, vulnerable. I got a letter last week. From my daughter. She's 12 now, living with her father in Seattle. She said she'd been reading about me online, about the case with Dr. Monroe, about everything that happened. And she said, Lena's voice broke. She said she was proud of me. That she wanted to see me. That maybe we could try again. Graham felt his throat tighten. Lena, that's incredible. It's terrifying, she admitted. I haven't seen her in 5 years. She was 7 when everything fell apart. What if she's disappointed? What if I let her down again? Then you get back up and try again, Graham said. Just like you've done with everything else. Just like you taught Evan to do. You don't have to be perfect, Lena. You just have to show up. She nodded, tears streaming down her face now, but she was smiling. "Thank you. For everything. For that night. For believing me. For standing with me when everyone else walked away. I know I can never really repay you." "You already have," Graham interrupted gently. "Every time you show up at this clinic. Every time you give someone else the same care you gave my son. Every time you choose to keep going despite everything that's tried to break you. That's repayment enough." They sat together as the night deepened, two people who'd found each other on the worst night of their lives and somehow, impossibly, saved each other. Not in the dramatic way of movies or fairy tales, but in the quiet, steady way of showing up and choosing courage when it would be easier to choose comfort. As Graham finally started his car to begin the long drive home, Lena leaned over and squeezed his hand once, a gesture of gratitude and friendship and something deeper, recognition. Two souls who'd been lost and found their way back through the storm. "You come with me," she said softly, echoing his words from that Christmas night. "Not as rescue. But as redemption." Graham smiled, understanding completely. "Yeah. I do." And as he drove away, watching Lena's small figure in his rearview mirror waving goodbye, standing outside the modest clinic where she was rebuilding her life one patient at a time, Graham felt something he hadn't felt in years. Gratitude. Not for what he had, but for what he'd become. Not for the empire he'd lost, but for the person he'd found underneath it all. The end. Graham Whitlock had everything the world tells us matters: wealth, power, respect, an empire with his name carved into its foundation. And in one moment of moral clarity, he chose to let it all burn for something the world says doesn't matter at all: the truth. He chose his son's healing over his reputation. He chose a stranger's vindication over his oldest friendship. He chose integrity over comfort, knowing the cost would be devastating. The question that haunts us isn't whether he made the right choice, it's whether we would have the courage to make the same one. When faced with destroying everything you've built to save someone who has nothing, what would you choose? When your best friend of 20 years stands on one side and a stranger who saved your child stands on the other, where do you place your loyalty? And when the world offers you an easy lie instead of a hard truth, which do you have the strength to accept? This story reminds us that redemption isn't found in what we accumulate, but in what we're willing to sacrifice when it matters most. That sometimes the people who save us are the ones we find freezing in the cold, invisible to everyone else. That courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing right over easy even when you're terrified of the cost. Graham lost an empire but found himself. Lena lost everything but reclaimed her dignity. Evan lost his innocence but gained his voice. And all of it started because one man stopped his car on a winter night and said 5 simple words: "You come with me." If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling us what choice you would have made in Graham's position. Your engagement helps us continue creating stories that matter, stories that challenge us to be better than we were yesterday. Thank you for listening, and remember, the measure of our character isn't what we do when it's convenient, but what we choose when everything is on the line.